So back in my 20s, I fell asleep behind the wheel and, like a boss, drove off a cliff into the Wilson River. And I learned from that experience that I was unworthy to be driving, and so I stopped. Until about 3 years later, when I realized that I was becoming a nuisance to everyone in my life and that I needed to find some other meaning from that experience. So I looked in the mirror, recognized that my life itself was a miracle, and that to honor that, I needed to do something important, which I try. Another thing that I learned from that experience is that experience itself does not create meaning. Facts and data do not create meaning. We create meaning by taking the facts and experiences in our lives and wrapping those in a story. It is through stories that our life is given meaning. It is through the stories that we tell and the stories that we choose to tell. But unfortunately, technology can make that difficult. We have a condition. There is so much information coming at us that many people struggle because their mental arteries are clogged and they cannot figure out what story to tell. In addition, one of my favorite authors, Neil Postman, back in 1984, wrote Amusing Ourselves to Death, where he predicted that we would get to a point where we are drowned in a sea of irrelevance. We are entertained so greatly that we don't even care anymore about telling our story. And then Max Headroom came along and taught us the blipvert, the idea that information would come to us so quickly in such small packets that we would literally explode. Thankfully, we don't explode, but information is coming to us and we deliver it in increasingly small pieces. And so how do we get from that, how do we take those small pieces and tell a story? Because stories look like this. Stories are a journey that begin with an obstacle that we struggle with until we finally overcome it. That's a story. How do we take all of that and put it into a tiny little package? Microstories. Microstories are the way we do that. And ironically, the best example of a microstory comes from 150 years ago when, as the story goes, Mark Twain was sitting in a bar with his buddies and made a bet that he could tell a story in 6 words that would make them cry. They took the bet. They lost the bet. This is the story. Right here. For sale. Baby shoes, never worn. Why does that work? It works because of implication. Mark Twain knew that he didn't have to tell the whole story. He only had to tell enough of it that the audience could fill in the rest. And in this case, they fill in the details and get their tragedy. Now, it doesn't have to be a tragedy. It doesn't even have to be in words. It could simply be a picture. We don't need to know the whole narrative to know what happened here. And the truth is, we don't even need to care what those filled-in details are. As the storyteller, all we need to do is tell the essence. And we have all these different mechanisms, all these different modes that allow us to do it, whether it's image or text or video or even song. But you might ask a question, why do I even care? Why should I worry about this? There are 2 reasons. One, if we're honest with ourselves, we know that we spend our lives constantly monitoring how our life story is working out. What is the story that we are creating with our life? And second, as human beings, we are constantly seeking meaning, which means that every time you send something out into the world, everyone who sees it is telling a story about you. And if all you're doing is sitting under the deluge of data and regurgitating that data back out into the world, that regurgitation becomes the body of the story of your life. Garbage out, garbage comes back in through that story. Yes, we have infobesity is a thing. It is. But we can choose to intentionally communicate back out what's important to us. And yes, we can amuse ourselves to death binge watching Game of Thrones. But we can also choose to spend other times doing things important and communicating well. And yes, it is true that our methods of communication are growing smaller and smaller, but through microstories, you have the ability to interact with technology in a way that saves your humanity, that tells your story. At the end of the day, the question is not whether your story will be written. It will be. The question to ask is whether it will be written by you. Cheers.